Hello and welcome back to the MMA Girl channel. This is the 24th episode of the MMA Girl Podcast. So welcome back and thank you very much for being here. Of course, today, as usual, we're going to go over the latest fight news, the latest fight announcements, and the latest fight rumours that have been swirling since we last spoke last week. So let's get into it. So the breaking news was the release from the UFC of course, Bryan Battle. Bryan Battle, the Butcher, has been officially released from the UFC since, of course, failing to make weight at UFC 319, especially since he was moving up to middleweight for this fight. He's already, of course, missed weight at welterweight twice. So this is the third time he's missed weight. And, of course, the fight was cancelled as a result of him missing weight because his opponent, Chimaev, did not want to fight Bryan Battle because he was 5 pounds over the limit for middleweight. So I don't know what was going on. I don't know how this happened. Someone who was, of course, a very loved and adored UFC fighter who had his own full violence collection. This is someone who is a fan favorite who unfortunately just hasn't got what it takes to make weight and be serious at the UFC. He recently did an interview on Ariel Helwani's show. Go check that out if you haven't seen it already. And he was saying that he wouldn't be surprised if the UFC released him, and he would completely understand why they released him because he hasn't been doing what he's supposed to be doing, which was making weight and being consistent and being a good fighter on the UFC roster. But it's just the same to see someone like that leave the UFC for reasons other than not being a good fighter or not being a fan favorite, because sometimes, like we saw with Martin Buday, who then recently, of course, signed to Octagon MMA, he was on a 3-fight win streak with the UFC. He was winning his fights at heavyweight, but he wasn't an interesting fighter, was definitely not a fan favorite, and the UFC cut him. So this time around, we've got someone who's a real fan favorite who does some great performances in the Octagon, just unfortunately doesn't make weight and isn't serious with the making weight side of things, which is so sad. I saw him fight at UFC Paris last year. He, of course, beat former UFC fighter Kevin Jousset, who was recently cut from the UFC as well. But a very stupid reason to be cut from the organization. That's very sad to see. And I hope all the best to Bryan Battle. So let's get into UFC 319 a bit. Of course, you may have seen my video on my UFC 319 reaction and breakdown. I'm just going to go into the fighter purses to kick this bit off. Starting off with Michael Venom Page, he landed a total of $410,000 for his performance against Jared Cannonier. Aaron Pico got $750,000 for his performance and his appearance at UFC 219 against Leron Murphy. Leron Murphy, of course, with his $50,000 bonus, he got $1,200,000. And Hamza Chimaev got $2,600,000 for his purse for UFC 319. And Dricus du Plessis, of course, got the most out of everyone, earning a whopping $3,800,000 for his performance and his appearance at UFC 319 in the main event against Khamzat. So that was the fighter purses for 319. Going into Chimaev a little bit, not to touch on it too much because we've already gone over that so many times, but Chimaev has had no injuries coming out of UFC 219. And as he stated to Joe Rogan in his post-fight Octagon interview, he would love to come back to the cage as soon as October, November. Now, despite Khamzat saying he's ready and he wants to be an active fighter, an active champion, the UFC aren't particularly interested in getting him back into the Octagon anytime soon. And I kind of understand it because he's a huge fighter. Like, this is Khamzat Chimaev, even before becoming, of course, the UFC middleweight champion, even before moving up to middleweight, he was already a huge star. Even though he didn't fight that often, his aura was mind-blowing. The amount of people that love this guy all over the world is insane. He's an international UFC MMA superstar. And now that he is champion of the middleweight division, of course he's going to have to be active because he's the champion. But I don't think we'll see him more than twice a year as champion because the UFC need to play it correctly. They need to plan out his fights really well and make sure that his fights happen on days where there aren't any other championship fights. If he comes back in October, we've already got 2 numbered cards in October with 3 title fights in total. Khamzat Chimaev is main event material only. So they will not be putting him in the co-main event, and they won't be putting Tomasimo versus Gane in the co-main event because Khamzat's in the main. I don't think that will happen. In November, that could be more likely. However, we don't know yet if there's going to be a belt defended or not. So if we see Khamzat coming back this year, it should be in November. But if we don't see him coming back this year, I wouldn't be surprised, because the UFC will want to make him wait and make the fans wait to see Khamzat once again. He's a big cash grab. We're not gonna lie to ourselves. He's a huge cash grab. The amount of people that watched UFC 319 that I know personally that don't watch MMA altogether, that just watched UFC 319 because Khamzat Chimaev was in it, blew my mind. So if another event comes around and you've got another Khamzat Chimaev versus someone for the middleweight belt fight, that is going to happen at a later stage where there is no other title fight in the main card, and he is definitely going to be the main event of that card. So if they can do it in November, I'd be happy with that. But if they don't do it in November, I'm not surprised. He meanwhile called out RDR, because a lot of people are saying RDR is the only person that could beat Khamzat Chimaev at the level of grappling that he is displaying in the octagon. We, of course, have had quite a few fights announced that I will get onto later on. But the middleweight contenders right now, like Fluffy, RDR, Paulo Costa, if you want to put him in the mix, and of course the former middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis, those people are in the bag, of course, in the mixed bag of potential contenders, along with, of course, Caio Bralo and Nassourdine Imavov. And we know that those two are fighting in September, and there has to be a winner, of course, that fight. That will determine the person who will be fighting Khamzat next. But in the meantime, if Khamzat fights this year, I don't think either Caio Bralo nor Nassourdine will be willing to fight in September and then fight in November for such an important fight. So if he fights in November, we'll need someone else to step up. And that's when I would love to see Paulo Costa come in, because he's been calling him out so many times. They've been talking, beefing online, and I would just love to see that. But out of everyone that is in the mix of middleweight contenders, people are saying, and I personally think also, that RDR is the only person that has a better chance against Khamzat to potentially counter his system that he puts in place when he gets into a fight and make it RDR's fight. Because, of course, when people are in the octagon with Khamzat Chimaev, it's always Khamzat's fight. So I would love to see RDR versus Khamzat Chimaev. But as you will see later on in this podcast, there's another challenge for RDR before he gets on to potentially fighting for the middleweight title. So we'll get onto that later. Other news that comes from UFC 319, just a quickie, was, of course, Kai Asakura. Kai Asakura, he lost, of course, his fight at UFC 319 to Tim Elliott via second-round submission. He lost also by second-round submission in his title fight against Pantoja. Recently, the news broke that Kai Asakura has officially asked Hunter Campbell to release him and let him go back to Rizin, because he no longer feels welcome at the UFC, and he feels like the level at the UFC is too much for him right now. So very sad to hear that Kai Asakura wants to leave the UFC, but it's not surprising after losing your debut fight to Pantoja, which is not a surprise because Pantoja is currently the flyweight GOAT. But then to lose to Tim Elliott a second time via submission and have 2 consecutive losses at the UFC, 0 wins, I think that must put a dent in your UFC record and will make you want to leave the organization, which is what's happening currently. So unfortunately, Kai Asakura will no longer be on the UFC roster. He has not been officially removed from the UFC roster, but I think slowly but surely we're going to be hearing whispers that he is going to be removed, and we may see the announcement very soon. On other news, UFC legend Frankie Edgar has officially come out of retirement, and he is signed to BKFC, probably thanks to the presence and involvement of Conor McGregor, of course. And he's come out of retirement to make his BKFC debut on October 4th versus Jimmy Rivera. Now, this fight is, of course, happening in New Jersey, so it's pending for now because the New Jersey Athletic Commission must approve of Frankie Edgar's return to combat sports. He probably already entered the testing pool a long time ago, but his announcement of him coming out of retirement has just come out now. So I'm very happy Frankie Edgar coming back to fighting. Maybe a little worried for him because he's going to BKFC, so it's not a very easy place to go when you are of that age and that you are already someone who has been in combat sports all your life. So you've taken a lot of knocks to your head, you've taken a lot of damage. Now he's going to BKFC, where damage is 100% obligatory, that you will take damage at BKFC, to the point where sometimes you can break something permanently or have permanent damage to your head or other parts of your body. So BKFC, I'm not sure of this choice, but Frankie Edgar wants the challenge. So he is challenging himself for something very huge here. going to BKFC and facing someone who is more used to this kind of format than himself entirely. But maybe Frankie Edgar feels he wants to be up to the challenge, and I would love to see how that turns out for him. So I hope the New Jersey Athletic Commission approve of his coming out retirement, and that they approve, of course, of him going back into combat sports, and we see this fight go down October 4th. So let's get into boxing a little bit whilst we're on the topic of fighting before we get into the latest fight updates. Now, Usyk, as I announced to you guys a couple of weeks ago, he has been commanded by the WBO to accept a fight against Joseph Parker to unify the heavyweight belts. Because, of course, Joseph Parker is the holder of the current interim heavyweight title. And, of course, when the interim champ and the actual champ are both active fighters, they must fight one another. Now, the WBO, of course, have given a couple of weeks, or at least a month, to Usyk to get a decision made and negotiate with Joseph Parker's team to get this fight announced. And, of course, they've given him up to the 23rd of August to make that happen. And he's, of course, not come up with the goods yet. We've not had any news yet that the negotiations have taken place. Apparently, Usyk is currently injured. That's the news of the day. He's currently injured, and he's asking for an extension on the time limit that WBO originally gave him, because he would like to enter negotiations with Joseph Parker, but not yet. So Joseph Parker, of course, has come to the conclusion that Usyk does not want to fight him. So if that's true, that's a shame, because unifying the belts would just be, logical. And I'd love to see Joseph Parker versus Usyk. But as I said, Usyk is looking for those exhibition fights. He's not looking for an actual exhibition fight, but he's actually looking for the big money fights like Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Dubois, etc. So he's not looking to fight someone like Joseph Parker, who is less hyped up. And so that would mean less money would come in for a fight against Joseph, which is just naturally... It's just the way of it. It's logic, unfortunately. So I think that's why they're dragging their heels a little bit at Usyk's camp. But Usyk would preferably like to do the trilogy with Tyson Fury, because Tyson's come out of retirement. So I think he'll probably relinquish the belt and give Joseph Parker the ultimate gift, which is not having to fight him and getting the belt for himself. I'm not sure if it works the same as the UFC, like with Tom Aspinall and John Jones, but in any case, Usyk does not look like he wants to fight Joseph Parker anytime soon. Next up, of course, we have the hot story of the moment, which is, of course, that Jake Paul will be taking on Gervonta Davis, Tank, in an exhibition fight in November. This will be exactly on November 15th, and it will happen on Netflix. So for any of you guys that have Netflix, I believe you'll be able to tune in for free. Of course, this was not the fight originally planned. We heard a lot of rumors that the negotiations between Jake Paul's team and AJ Styles. I watched too much WWE. We have learned, of course, that negotiations between Jake Paul's team and Anthony Joshua's team had taken place and were underway. Now, apparently, that has fallen through because there were some issues regarding network conflicts, which meant, of course, that Jake Paul may have asked for it to be on Netflix with his company, and maybe Anthony Joshua didn't want it to be on Netflix, or Anthony Joshua's team didn't see the interest in putting it on Netflix, because that's not how Anthony Joshua does things. So that's what happened, and that has fallen through. So the replacement for Anthony Joshua against Jake Paul is Gervonta Davis. Now, Gervonta Davis is, of course, a retired fighter now. He announced, or at least his team announced recently, he had hung up his gloves. So this kind of makes sense. He's doing an exhibition fight now against Jake Paul. He has all to gain and nothing to lose. Even if he loses this fight, which is highly likely, because even if Gervonta Davis is someone who KOs the majority of his opponents, I think the size difference between himself and Jake Paul, just in terms of height, will be a huge disadvantage for Davis. But I could be wrong. Davis could win, like he's always do, and maybe KO Jake Paul, which I would love to see. But I just think he's putting himself out there in a fight that he may not win, but he doesn't care anymore, because there's nothing at stake. It's just a big money fight, Davis versus Jake Paul. And they'll do, of course, the whole WWE style conflicts, their face-to-faces, their one-on-one discussions where there'll be a mediator, the press conference. Everything will be done perfectly as it usually is for Jake Paul and his fights, and there'll be some kind of conflict between himself and Davis that will be made up or created through their words that they say to each other, and it will just be a crazy situation to build up this fight and sell the fight, of course, to everyone. And it will be a big fight. It'll be a big fight. There's no doubt about it. Now, this fight is apparently going to be taking place in Atlanta, so I'm excited to see what's going to be happening during that fight, who else is going to be on this card, and of course, if this fight is also held up, because it's been announced officially, but will it happen? We don't know yet. In any case, that's what's happening in Jake Paul's camp, and he's, of course, probably happy to at least have an opponent in a really iconic opponent in that, because seeing him take on people that are more and more respected in the boxing world is kind of crazy to see, but we're just gonna have to get used to it, because this is Jake Paul's world, and in boxing at least, we're just living in it. Next up, we heard some news from Gable Stevenson. Gable Stevenson, for those who don't know, is an Olympic gold medalist from America, and he's a wrestler, so an Olympic gold wrestler, and he is now going to be making his MMA debut in September on the 12th in LFA. So LFA, of course, is a big organization of MMA, and we get a lot of people come from LFA to the UFC. So it's kind of the training ground for the UFC, as is, for example, Cage Warriors, as is a lot of different organizations that the UFC pluck talents from. Gable Stevenson has joined the LFA, which is also an organization where they do give a lot of their talents to the UFC once they've built them up. So I'm really excited for this, because, of course, Gable Stevenson, this is someone who has helped a lot of our UFC fighters get better in wrestling in their camps. John Jones notably has done his last camp with, of course, Gordon Ryan and Gable Stevenson. And Gable Stevenson has been in John Jones' corner for his fight against Stipe. So this is a really cool idea that he's coming into MMA. And I love seeing crossovers like that. I'd love to one day see Teddy Riner, of course, the French judo gold medalist, the icon that is Teddy Riner, come to the UFC. And of course, he has established that he would like to do one more Olympic Games before, of course, going to do other things. And he doesn't think it's likely he'll do any kind of UFC or anything, but I would love to have seen that. But anyway, Gable Stevenson is still very young, still in his prime. So I'd be excited to see how he will fare as a MMA fighter. Of course, wrestling's not an issue, but of course, he'll need to work on his striking, his boxing, of course, but we've seen wrestlers do very well in the UFC. For example, Daniel Cormier, double champ. So why not Gable Stevenson as well? So going on to Dana White's Contender Series, of course, every episode at the moment is amazing, and I love watching Dana White's Contender Series. Luke Riley has signed his contract with the UFC thanks to his performance at Dana White's Contender Series from Cage Warriors, and he won via second round TKO over his opponent in Dana White's Contender Series and got himself a contract. So anyway, that's a great sign. I'm going to pop on my screen the photo of someone who was on Dana White's Contenders last week. Now, this is someone I will probably do a video on my TikTok about, because I found him extremely, how would I say this, caricaturial. His name is Josh Hockett, and he's taken himself to be more of a WWE wrestler than an actual real MMA fighter, even though he's really good in the cage. He won via second round TKO over his opponent, and he absolutely slaughtered him with some elbows. And he is a heavyweight, so the heavyweight pool at the UFC is a lot smaller than some of the other divisions. So the UFC was happy, of course, to sign Josh Hockett to the UFC, but his post-fight interview was just pure gold. I mean, I'm the kind of person, I've lived and grown up with wrestling and with WWE, so I love that kind of stuff. But when it comes to the UFC, we're kind of on a more serious level here. So that's not sort of the thing we will see on the UFC, but why not bring someone that's got a bit more personality, a lot of confidence, and someone who will, of course, change the heavyweight division, because they're not really in the heavyweight division. We haven't got anyone that's big-mouthed, that's, confident, that's going to badmouth his opponents to make the rivalries even more juicy. And I think this guy, however, Josh Hockett, will definitely be the personality of the heavyweight division if he is any good with the other guys on the roster, because he's an American wrestler, his striking is good, but will he fare well against some of the big guys in the heavyweight division at the UFC? We don't know yet. So I hope the UFC will find him a fight soon so we can test him against someone on the UFC's heavyweight roster to see if he'll be able to slip into the top 10 and maybe, just maybe, become one of the biggest stars in the UFC. But I think he has the potential, if his personality and his skills in the octagon are at the same level, he's going to have a bright future ahead of him at the UFC. But if his personality is up there and his skills are down there, unfortunately, that won't go very far. Let's go on to the latest fight announcements. Now, you have, of course, UFC Vancouver coming up on October 18th. I say you, but we have UFC Vancouver coming up. And the main event has been announced, of course, as I spoke to you about earlier. And it's between, of course, Anthony Hernandez, Fluffy, and RDR, Reina de Ryder. Now, this main event should not have happened originally, or was not going to happen originally, because the initial plan was to put Ian Gary in the main event against Sean Brady, the fight that should have happened at welterweight way before any of this Hernandez versus RDR was announced. Now, apparently, according to Sean Brady, he has been pushing for this fight with Ian Gary for the longest time, and he has always wanted this fight with Ian Gary. So in no way, shape, or form would he have put anything in the way of getting this fight. However, Ian Gary is dragging his heels about this fight, and he eventually said no. So this should have been the main event between Sean Brady and Ian Gary, but unfortunately for Sean Brady, Ian Gary is not interested in fighting you, or at least not interested in fighting you in October in Vancouver. That's a real shame, and I think it's sad that Ian Gary is refusing fights now. I don't think he can really afford to, since he has not fought since we saw him against Carlos Prates. So not really sure why Ian Gary is refusing. Anyway, on this card, we have Hernandez versus RDR. I'm very excited to see that. A lot of people are very confused why we're doing this fight, because people wanted to see Hernandez and RDR come up in the middleweight rankings on their own without having to face each other and burst one of each other's bubbles. Because it's true that Hernandez is on an 8-fight win streak right now, and he just defeated Delide a couple of weeks ago in the most trash, mean way possible, and I loved it. And then we had, of course, RDR, who just defeated Robert Whittaker in a 5-round war in Abu Dhabi. And they're both, of course, on winning streaks. RDR has had 4 fights in 12 months at the UFC. So he's on a really good streak right now. And to burst one of those guys' bubble, even before knowing who next is going to face Khamzat, is a bit of a shame. But I see it as a good match, because we're getting Caio Brado versus Imavov in September. That's going to determine who's going to be facing Khamzat. But this fight is kind of a number 1 contenders fight as well. So the winner of this fight will then have another ticket to get a title fight against Khamzat Chimaev. And I see this fight being a real war, and I'm excited to see who will come up on the top of this fight, because it's a real dilemma. I don't know who would win in between Hernandez and RDR right now. I don't know who I'd pick. Luckily, it's in October, so we've got time to look into it and reflect on who may win this fight. But in any case, I'm very excited. On this card, we have, of course, Chito Marlon Vera. He's coming back after all this time, and he'll be facing Zahabi. And we also have Kevin Holland, who will be coming back, who will be facing Mike Malott. Kevin Holland, 15th ranked UFC welterweight contender, of course, coming back for the 5th time this year. And he may not be getting the 6 fights in 1 year that he wanted, but at least he'll be coming back for his 5th fight of the year. So I'm very excited to see Kevin Holland back. He's a great fighter, and we always love to see him. We also have Manon Fiorot, who will be back after her last fight against Valentina Shevchenko, where she, of course, lost to Valentina, and she'll be taking on Jasudavicius. And this will be a great fight, honestly, a real war between these two girls. Next up, we have some fight announcements from BKFC. BKFC, of course, as I told you guys, October 4th, it'll be happening, and we are potentially seeing Frankie Edgar coming out of retirement on this fight card. But we have got a fight announcement that's been made official, and it's between, of course, Jeremy Stephens and the legend that is Mike Perry, who is back signed to BKFC for a King of Violence title fight to determine who is the most violent BKFC fighter on the whole roster. And this is great, guys. I cannot wait to see Mike Perry back in BKFC. The King of Violence fight means that we're getting Mike Perry back, and Mike Perry's fighting style in BKFC, and just Mike Perry's aura when he was in a BKFC ring, is just craziness, and I loved seeing his fights. So when he left BKFC, I was a little bummed because it wasn't the same for me. So now that he's back in BKFC, I'm so excited. So that's happening October 4th. Mark it on your calendars, guys. Frankie Edgar's probably going to be back from retirement. And, of course, you're getting Mr. Mike Perry, the money man, who is back at BKFC. At UFC Paris, of course, as I said, I'll be there. We're getting Caio Brado versus Nasruddin Imavov for the number 1 contender spot in the middleweight division. And another fight has been announced at featherweight for this fight card. We don't know the order of the fights yet on this card, so I'm announcing this fight. He may be on the main card. I hope so, but I'm not sure yet. But Patricio Pitbull, number 12 ranked featherweight, Patricio Pitbull, of course, after winning his last fight, has been put up against a former champion, a Belgian champion, who is called Losen Keita. And this guy looks ferocious. So I'm not sure if the UFC are trying to test him with Patricio or just throw Patricio to the wolves. But in any case, this is happening in Paris. So K2 is much more likely to have a bit more of an aura because he's Belgium and he's in France. So this is a real big fight, and I'm really excited to see what's going to happen between these two guys. And I don't know why this has been out so late on, only a month before the card is happening. So I'm not sure how long Patricio has known that he'll be fighting this new guy, but I'm not sure it's been a while. So he's been putting to this fight at the last minute, and I hope that Patricio will fare well against someone that looks like a dangerous fighter. So we'll see if that translates well at the UFC. These both guys are new to the UFC, so the UFC level isn't upheld either by one or the other. So we'll see what will happen in this fight. Stay tuned, of course, for UFC Paris on the 6th of September. The last few fights have been announced before I go into the rumors are UFC Noche. We finally, of course, have got Rosas Jr.'s fight come out against Font. So Rob Font is taking on Rosas Jr. I knew Rosas Jr. was going to be on this card, as he always is for UFC Noche, but we hadn't had a fight announcement for him yet. So we're finally getting the return of Chiwiwi to the UFC at UFC Noche in September. Last fight that has been confirmed right now and has been announced today is a UFC Perth. I did tell you guys about, of course, the announcement that have been going on for UFC Perth, and we have, of course, Junior Taffa, who is coming back after his first loss at light heavyweight to Tuko Tukos, and he'll be taking on Aslan at light heavyweight. Hopefully he'll be able to stay on the feet this time and get the win. However, I did say that it was a shame his brother Justin Taffa isn't coming back for a fight at the UFC just yet. And lo and behold, they have just announced that Justin Taffa will also be on the UFC Perth main card. So this is amazing, guys. We're having both Taffa brothers on the same card. Justin Taffa is back, and he'll be taking on a newbie from the Great British top team in England, of course, who's called Louis Sutherland, and he's called the Vanilla Gorilla. I love his nickname. He'll be coming and fighting out of Scotland, England, for the first time on the main card against Justin Taffa, and I hope for Justin that he'll be able to show Louis Sutherland what it's like with the UFC in the heavyweight division and be able to show us off as we should. So coming out of the losing column, of course, he needs a win now, as does his brother. So I hope both guys come up with the win, because they'll be in the continent, they'll be in Australia, just next to New Zealand, so they need that win. Anyway, are you guys happy that Justin Taffa and Junior Taffa are going to be in the same card? And are you happy that Justin Taffa is finally coming back? Let me know in the comments down below. Last segment of this podcast is the rumored targeted fights that are happening or not in next coming months. Renato Moicano may be making his return since his submission loss against Islam Makhachev early this year for UFC Rio on October 11th. Now, this could be happening with, of course, Charles Oliveira and Fiziev in the main event. That's definitely happening, of course. And we know now that Renato Moicano may be on the card, and he may be taking on Nazim Sadikov. Now, I watched the Show Me Money podcast with Renato Moicano and Gilbert Burns, and Gilbert asked Renato, are you planning on coming back this year? And he thought, Gilbert, that Renato Moicano was coming back for UFC Rio. And Renato just said, no, maybe next year. I think initially that was true, but I also think that Gilbert asked him because he'd heard rumors that he might be coming back in at UFC Rio. So I think maybe that Renato Moicano was saying no because he didn't want to say anything about it yet. But I believe that he knew there was something preparing itself in the background. So this may be what he was hinting at, and we may be seeing Sadikov versus Renato Moicano, Money Moicano, at UFC Rio in front of his own people. So I would love to see that, and I hope it happens, and I hope to see Renato Moicano in the octagon again this year at some point. Next up on the rumor list, we have also a rumor that obviously will happen, but we haven't had the announcement yet, is of course Leroy Murphy versus Alexander Volkanovski. This is not a rumor, this is more just a targeted fight that has been agreed to verbally by Dana White, of course, at UFC 319. This is going to be happening probably in December for the, of course, featherweight belt. Now, this is happening on December 13th, if all goes to plan, and this could be on the same card potentially as Ilia Topuria versus Justin Gaethje, which is also a targeted fight for UFC 323, but also it's been confirmed that Ilia is coming back in December, so why not put Ilia and Alexander Volkanovski, both champions now in their own divisions, why not put them on the same card, 2 championship fights on the same card, and see those guys have it out with their opponents, and I can't wait to see that. So targeted, of course, for UFC 323 is Justin Gaethje versus Ilia Topuria for the lightweight belt, and potentially Leroy Murphy and Alexander Volkanovski for the featherweight belt. I'd love to see those two fights happen. We know that the featherweight bout is next up for Leon Murphy, so that's definitely going to happen. But when, we don't know yet. Now, another fight that was mainly established at UFC 319 last weekend was Carlos Prates. He wants a fight at UFC Rio as well. And that's happening, as I said, on October 11th in Rio. So UFC Rio is happening. It's been about 6 years since the UFC have come to Brazil, so I can't wait for that to happen. And Carlos Prates, he called out Leon Edwards in the octagon when he had his interview with Joe Rogan. But since then, he's had a few discussions with MVP. They'd love to fight with each other, so they get along very well. But MVP is looking for the smoke. He moved up to middleweight because he said the politics at welterweight was too much for him, and he wanted the smoke. He didn't want the politics. But if Carlos Prates is willing to fight MVP, I'm sure MVP will be happy to move back down to welterweight to see if he can get a piece of Carlos Prates or not. The last fight that has been rumored to be happening at UFC 321 in Abu Dhabi with Chimaev and Cyril Gane as the main event for the heavyweight title. So another fight that's been rumored for this fight card on October 25th is Paulo Costa versus Israel Adesanya. Now, Israel Adesanya, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. He has stated that he only wants rematches. So he wants to do it again with Sean Strickland, Paulo Costa, maybe one day Dricus du Plessis again. But he wants rematches to avenge his losses to these guys. So he may have accepted a fight against Paulo Costa. Of course, Paulo Costa has been calling out quite often Chimaev, but I don't think Paulo Costa has done enough yet to earn a fight against Hamza Chimaev, and I think everyone will be in agreement with me on that one. So maybe a fight against Israel Adesanya in between those two fights could be the best way or the best stepping stone for Paulo Costa to get to the title fight. But now that obviously Israel Adesanya is 5th ranked in the UFC's middleweight division, getting to 5th ranks is a good idea for Paulo Costa so he can get in that title discussion, but he may need another fight after that one to be number one contender and have a fight against Hamza Chimaev at middleweight. Anyway, that's what's been targeted for UFC Abu Dhabi. I hope it happens. I hope we see Israel Adesanya come back at Abu Dhabi. And nonetheless, even if it's not against Paulo Costa, and Paulo Costa on his end, I'd love to see him back very soon. Of course, his last fight against Kopylov at UFC 318 went very well for him. So he said he'll be coming back later on this year as well. So excited to see if those fights are announced or not. I'll keep you guys updated on that one. In the meantime, check out my other videos on this channel whilst waiting for my next video, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe as usual. I'll see you guys later. Bye.